Hey there, welcome back. Tonight, we're taking a quiet journey into a world of marble light, salt wind, and eternal curiosity. The world of ancient Greece. Long before Europe had a name, before temples gleamed on the Acropolis, or philosophers asked what it meant to live a good life, small communities of farmers and sailors scattered across stony islands began something that would echo for millennia. They built homes of clay and stone upon hills that overlooked the restless Aegean, carved myths into memory, and found beauty not in conquest, but in the rhythm of the sea and the perfection of form. Few civilizations have shaped our minds so completely. The words you speak, the way your city governs, even the stories that shape your dreams, all carry the quiet fingerprints of this ancient world. Their descendants live not only in modern Greece, but in every culture that inherited democracy, philosophy, theater, and the restless human urge to ask why. By watching this video, you will be able to learn who the ancient Greeks were, who their descendants are today, how they lived and worked, what they wore, what they believed, and why their ideas still shape our modern world. You'll see not only the temples and wars, but also the soft, unseen moments. A mother spinning wool beside a hearth, a fisherman whispering to the sea, a poet watching the sun sink behind olive hills. So let's slow down, breathe a little, and take a closer look at what life was really like in the land that taught the world how to think, to speak, and to dream. All you have to do is settle in, get comfortable, and let the story drift over you, like warm air rising from sun-baked stone. Before we begin, I'd like to share something small. If you enjoy these calm journeys through history, consider liking the video or subscribing, only if you truly enjoy it. I upload new videos every day. Turn on the bell if you'd like to join our nightly journeys. And while you're here, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. I love imagining this quiet constellation of listeners scattered across the world, drifting off to the same story beneath different skies. Now, let's step softly into the beginning. It starts not with kings or empires, but with islands. Aegean waves kiss the shores of Crete, Naxos, and Rhodes, scattering foam like powdered marble. The scent of pine and thyme drifts from the hillsides. People live close to the land here, shepherds, potters, and sailors, their lives woven between earth and sea. At dawn, the markets hum with barter, olives, honey, clay jars, and fish still wet from the nets. By night, stories of gods and heroes flicker in the firelight. These people are the first Greeks, though they do not yet call themselves so. They build small shrines to unseen powers, offering wine and grain to the wind, the river, the hearth. They speak of Poseidon's moods, of Artemis in the forest, of Gaia who never sleeps. To them, the divine is everywhere, in the thunder above and the bread beneath their hands. Villages cluster near coves, where the sea both feeds and threatens. The Aegean is their road, and wooden boats their bridges between worlds. Traders from distant lands arrive carrying copper, ivory, and strange perfumes. Each encounter plants a seed, a new idea, a word, a myth. In time, these seeds will bloom into something vast, a civilization defined not by walls, but by curiosity. The hillsides shimmer with olive trees, each older than memory. Their twisted roots drink the same rain that once fell on Mycenaean kings and wandering poets. The sound of flutes drifts from shepherds on distant slopes, mingling with the steady hum of cicadas. In this world, labor and worship are the same motion, tilling the soil, raising a home, shaping clay. Every act is both survival and art. Children learn early to listen, to the teacher's voice reciting verse, to the philosopher's questions, to the rhythms of oars striking the sea. Women weave stories into fabric, men carve meaning into stone. Life moves in circles, harvest to harvest, festival to festival, each one a gentle rehearsal of eternity. When night falls, the stars reflect upon the water like scattered coins, and the people of Greece look upward and see not chaos, but pattern. They named the constellations, heroes, beasts, and gods, mapping meaning onto infinity. Perhaps this is where philosophy begins, not in the academy, but beneath the open sky, where thought and wonder first share the same breath. Centuries will pass before Athens or Sparta rise, before names like Plato or Pericles are spoken. But already something distinct stirs here, a love of balance, of beauty, of questioning. In the stillness between the surf and the wind, a civilization begins to whisper to the future, and as the waves roll against the rocky shore, you might feel it too, that quiet, enduring heartbeat beneath the Aegean sky. The story deepens beneath the waves, to an age when bronze gleamed brighter than the sun, and kings ruled from palaces built of dreams. Long before Athens or Sparta, two worlds rose and fell, the Minoans of Crete and the Mycenaeans of the Greek mainland. Together they became the bones of legend, the whispering ancestors of all who would later call themselves Hellenes. On the island of Crete, the sea was both protector and path. Ships carved with eyes sailed from port to port, their sails swelling like the chests of living creatures. The Minoans were traders and builders, lovers of color and movement. Their palaces were not fortresses, but labyrinths, open courtyards filled with light, painted columns, and walls alive with frescoes of dolphins, dancers, and lilies. The air would have smelled of saffron and oil, of sheep's wool drying on wooden frames. Music echoed through corridors as women in flowing dresses, tight at the waist, wide at the sleeves, carried baskets of grain, figs, and honey. There were no high walls here, no signs of fear. The people of Crete seemed to trust the sea more than soldiers, yet the sea is never constant. Beneath the calm, the earth itself shifted. Around 1600 BCE, a great volcano erupted on the island of Thera, modern Santorini, sending ash into the sky and waves across the Aegean. Some say it shattered the Minoan world, drowning fleets and silencing songs. Others say the empire simply faded, worn down by trade and time. What remains are fragments, bright paintings, clay tablets, a labyrinth without a minotaur. On the mainland, the Mycenaeans rose where the Minoans fell. Their cities were strongholds of stone, their kings obsessed with glory and gold. They carved lions above their gates and buried their dead beneath beehive tombs glittering with bronze masks. They learned the Minoans' writing, reshaping it into linear B, the earliest form of written Greek. And they carried their ambitions across the sea, to Troy, to legend. It's strange to think that the Iliad, a poem written centuries later, still hums with the pulse of this vanished age. Bronze spears, wooden ships, the cries of men and gods, all memory now, yet alive in every retelling. The Mycenaeans believed their heroes would never die as long as someone spoke their names, and in that they were right. Daily life here was harsh, but filled with purpose. Farmers plowed narrow fields between rocky hills. Women spun wool into thread by firelight. Children watched craftsmen hammer bronze into blades, dreaming of battles sung by poets. Cattle grazed under olive trees, and the smoke from hearths curled into the cold air. Their homes were small, but their imaginations vast, peopled with gods who quarreled and kings who sought immortality. The Mycenaeans' world was connected to others, Egypt, Anatolia, Mesopotamia, by invisible threads of trade and story. In their ships, they carried jars of oil and amphorae of wine. They returned with ivory, amber, and tales of distant empires. Through them, Greece became part of something larger, a network of exchange where myth and metal flowed together. But glory burns quickly. Around 1200 BCE, the world of the Mycenaean kings began to unravel. Palaces were abandoned, cities burned, trade vanished. Perhaps it was invasion, perhaps drought, or simply the weight of ambition itself. Whatever the cause, Greece fell silent. The scribes stopped writing, and for centuries no one remembered how to read their clay tablets. The people scattered. Farmers became wanderers. Merchants turned to herding goats among the ruins of once great halls. The stories of heroes and gods were kept alive not by kings or priests, but by voices, the grandmothers who whispered by the fire, the singers who walked from village to village with a lyre across their back. From those fading voices, memory became myth, and myth, in time, became history once more. As the fires of Mycenae cooled and the bronze dulled to green, the Greeks entered what we now call the Dark Age. Yet even darkness can protect the seeds of light. In the silence of loss, a new identity began to form, humbler, wiser, still watching the horizon for dawn. Somewhere, a shepherd still sang of Achilles. Somewhere, a mother still taught her child to weave and pray. And somewhere, in the dim corners of a ruined palace, a single potter still turned his wheel, shaping clay into something beautiful. Because beauty, even then, refused to die. The world had changed, but Greece had not vanished. It merely slept, waiting for the next breath of wind to carry its story forward. When the last fires of Mycenae went out, Greece entered a silence so deep it almost forgot its own name. The great palaces stood empty, their courtyards filled with weeds. Traders stopped coming. The bronze that once gleamed in the sun dulled to rust, and words themselves began to vanish from memory. The art of writing disappeared, not suddenly, but like the fading echo of a song that no one remains to sing. This was the Greek Dark Age, though those who lived it would not have called it that. To them, life simply became smaller. Villages replaced cities, barter replaced coin, and the tales of kings and heroes survived only in story. People moved inland or fled to the islands, searching for land that could still feed them. They built homes of mud and timber, tended goats and barley, and watched the horizon with quiet uncertainty. And yet, in this dimness, there was endurance. Even when the great walls crumbled, the spirit of the people did not. The Greeks were still there, in the smoke of the hearth, in the rhythm of the seasons, in the whispered prayers to unseen gods. Though they no longer carved their thoughts into clay, they carried them in their hearts, passing them from one voice to another, like embers cupped in the hand. At night, when the wind fell still, stories filled the darkness. Around a fire, an elder might sing of a hero who sailed beyond the edge of the world, or of a goddess who turned into a tree to escape the love of Apollo. Children would listen with wide eyes as myths became memory and memory became myth. These tales would one day become the Iliad and the Odyssey, but here, in the quiet centuries before writing returned, they were the only light that remained. The landscape itself shaped the people who survived. Greece is a land of contrasts, hard stone and fertile valleys, cold mountains and gentle coasts. To live there was to understand both beauty and hardship. The soil demanded patience, the sea demanded skill. Every family depended on both. In small huts of reed and clay, smoke from olive wood fires drifted upward through the thatch. Men fished by torchlight, while women wove rough wool into cloaks thick enough to hold off the wind. It was during this age that iron began to replace bronze, a silent revolution born not of wealth but necessity. Iron was everywhere, hidden in dark seams of rock, waiting to be tamed. A blacksmith could now make a blade without needing foreign tin. Slowly, new tools and weapons spread from hand to hand, and the Greeks began to rebuild. It was not the grandeur of palaces that returned first, but the quiet confidence of the plow and the hearth. Trade, too, awoke from its long sleep. Small boats once again crossed the Aegean, carrying jars of oil, painted pottery, and fragments of hope. The Phoenicians brought new ideas, their alphabet, their dyes, their restless energy. From these encounters, the Greeks learned to write again, reshaping foreign symbols into their own letters. For the first time in centuries, words regained their shape. The first poems written in this reborn script were not about kings or gods, but about human endurance, hunger, love, anger, longing. The Greeks began to see themselves as something more than subjects of fate. Their myths still spoke of divine will, but within those stories, mortals began to matter. It was the beginning of a shift that would, centuries later, give birth to philosophy itself. Still, daily life remained humble. Most people were farmers, tending small plots of barley or wheat. Sheep and goats grazed on rocky hillsides. Olives and grapes became treasures of the table. Life followed the rhythm of the seasons, plowing in autumn, sowing in winter, harvesting under the summer sun. There were no great armies, no marble temples, only the simple rituals that gave shape to existence. A libation poured to the gods, a song at the end of the day, a child's laughter echoing through the hills. In these centuries of quiet, something remarkable happened. The Greeks began to remember who they were, not through conquest or monument, but through shared story. The songs of wandering poets, the aoidoi, became the heartbeat of a culture reborn. They sang of Troy and its heroes, of the wrath of Achilles and the wanderings of Odysseus. These were not merely tales of war, but mirrors of human endurance, stories that reminded people they belonged to something greater than the narrow valley they called home. As generations passed, the darkness began to lift. Villages grew larger, small shrines became temples, the first walls rose once more. Communities gathered not just for trade, but for worship and assembly. Slowly, the idea of the polis, the city-state, began to take form. Each polis was a world unto itself, yet all spoke the same tongue, worshipped the same gods, and shared the same longing for order after chaos. By the 9th century BCE, Greece was stirring again. The songs of the poets became the threads from which identity was woven. The people had no written laws, but they had stories, stories that told them who they were and what kind of world they wished to build. From these fireside tales came ideals that would define the Greek soul: courage, reason, and beauty. It's easy from our distance to see the Dark Age as emptiness, but to those who lived through it, it was something else entirely. A long night of waiting, of remembering, of quietly rebuilding. The flame had not gone out. It had merely been sheltered from the wind. And when dawn came again over the Aegean, Greece was ready to rise from its own ashes. Somewhere on a hillside, a child traced letters into the dirt, alpha, beta, gamma, and smiled without knowing he was writing the future. Part 4. The Return of Light. The dawn that followed Greece's long night did not come suddenly. It arrived quietly, in the sound of a lyre being tuned at sunrise, in the scratch of a reed stylus pressing symbols into clay, in the laughter of children learning words their ancestors had forgotten. After centuries of silence, the Greeks began to find their voice again. They learned to write, not in the old, rigid scripts of palaces, but in a new alphabet borrowed and reshaped from the Phoenicians. Simple, elegant, adaptable. With it, they could capture speech itself, not just lists of goods or oaths of kings. It meant that anyone with patience and purpose could learn to write a story, record a law, or carve a name into stone. It was an act of quiet revolution, and with words came memory. The old oral songs, carried through generations, now took form on papyrus and parchment. The blind poet Homer, whether one man or many, gathered the scattered fragments of the past and wove them into the great epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey. They were not histories, yet through them Greece remembered its own soul, the nobility of struggle, the beauty of courage, and the endless longing for home. In these verses, the Greeks saw mirrors of themselves. Achilles embodied the restless fire of youth, Odysseus, the cunning endurance of survival. Gods and mortals walked the same paths, feasted at the same tables, wept for the same reasons. From the ruins of the Mycenaean age, myth and meaning were born anew. As villages grew into towns, the landscape began to change. Houses were built of stone rather than clay, roofed with tiles instead of straw. Narrow streets twisted between whitewashed walls. At the center of each settlement, a small open space appeared, the agora, a marketplace and meeting ground that would one day become the heart of Greek political life. People gathered there not only to trade but to talk, to share news, to debate, to dream. Religion, too, took on new shape. The gods of old remained, but they now had temples, modest at first, later magnificent. Priests tended sacred fires, processions filled the streets, and festivals turned labor into celebration. Offerings of bread, oil, and wine were made not in fear, but in reverence. The Greeks believed the gods lived near them, watching from mountains and rivers, their presence woven into the wind itself. On the island of Delos, singers performed hymns to Apollo beneath an open sky. In Delphi, smoke rose from the oracle's cave, where the priestess's voice trembled with visions. On Crete, dancers still moved in circles to drums that echoed ancient rhythms. Everywhere, art returned, painted pottery, carved figurines, songs that praised the sea, the harvest, and the enduring light of day. The Greek world was awakening, but not as an empire. There was no single ruler, no unified state. Instead, there were many small communities, each fiercely independent, yet connected by language, belief, and custom. These would soon become the city-states, or polis, of classical Greece. Each had its own government, its own laws, its own way of seeing the world. In their differences lay both strength and tension. Daily life, though still simple, began to feel more secure. Farmers plowed their fields, in rhythm with the sun, guided by oxen and patience. Women tended hearths and gardens, spinning wool into soft cloth and telling stories to their children. Fishermen cast nets into the dawn light, while shepherds followed flocks across the high hills. In the evenings, families gathered for bread, olives, and wine, their talk drifting into song. The Greeks were becoming craftsmen of both matter and mind. Potters refined their shapes, turning humble vessels into art. Blacksmiths forged tools and weapons of surprising precision. Weavers dyed their fabrics in shades of crimson and indigo. But perhaps the most important craft was one of thought, the shaping of ideas. From every act of making came a sense that order and beauty could coexist, that the world itself could be understood. Out of this new confidence came colonies, small groups of settlers sailing across the Aegean and beyond, founding towns along the coasts of Asia Minor, Sicily, and the Black Sea. These journeys were not conquests, but extensions of hope. Each colony carried with it the language, customs, and stories of home. In this way, Greek culture spread like sunlight over distant shores, and still, in the evenings, the poets sang. Their verses were recited in megarons and marketplaces, beneath fig trees and in the glow of hearths. The words were rhythmic, almost hypnotic, tales of pride and downfall, of wisdom and folly, of gods who resembled men, and men who dreamed of gods. For the people listening, these stories were more than entertainment. They were identity. They reminded them that they were part of something ancient and enduring. This was the true return of light, not the rise of marble or empire, but the reawakening of thought. For the first time since the palaces of Crete had fallen, the Greeks began to look outward, across the sea, across the stars, and into the mysteries of the human heart. They did not yet know that they were building the foundation of what we would one day call the Western world. To them, it was simply life, the hum of bees in the vineyards, the murmur of the market, the calm rhythm of the sea against the shore. But history would remember this moment as the first glimmer of a civilization that would change everything. And as the sun set behind the olive hills, painting the sky in gold, and violet, the people of Greece, farmers, sailors, poets, and dreamers stepped into a future that was entirely their own. The darkness was gone. The light had returned. Part 5. The Birth of the Polis. The reborn Greek world did not build empires. It built communities, living organisms of stone, song, and shared belief. From the dust of forgotten kingdoms rose the polis, the city-state. It was not merely a collection of walls or houses. It was an idea, a way of belonging. Each polis was like a small universe. Within its boundaries stood the sacred and the ordinary together, the temple beside the marketplace, the council hall beside the olive press. Around it stretched farmland, guarded by mountains or by sea. To belong to a polis was to be more than a resident. It was to be a participant in the great experiment of human organization. For the first time, identity meant not just tribe or kin, but citizenship. On rocky plains, Athens grew around the Acropolis, its citadel crowned with shrines to Athena, goddess of wisdom and war. Across the southern hills, Sparta took shape, not around walls, but around discipline, its strength drawn from unity and endurance. To the west, Corinth prospered through trade. To the north, Thebes watched over fertile valleys. Each city developed a distinct soul, yet all were recognizably Greek, proud, restless, curious, devoted to beauty and reason in equal measure. The heart of every city was its agora, an open square paved in dust and sunlight. Here, fishmongers called out the morning's catch, merchants weighed oil and wine, potters sold red figure vases still warm from the kiln. But the agora was more than a market. It was where the free men gathered to speak. Politics, philosophy, and gossip flowed together in the same air. Arguments rose and faded like the cries of seabirds. Ideas were tested, laughter shared, and decisions made. Around the agora stood the buildings that defined the civic life. The council chamber, where elders debated laws. The stoas, long colonnades providing shade. The small temples where offerings burned. Citizens met to discuss everything from taxes to festivals. Their world was small, but their words carried the weight of destiny. Beyond the walls, life followed the rhythm of the seasons. Farmers worked sunrise to dusk, their hands thick with calluses and soil. They grew barley and grapes, pressed olives for oil, and herded goats along the rocky slopes. Women wove wool into chitons and dyed cloth with saffron and madder. Children learned letters and music, running barefoot through courtyards where the smell of bread and smoke lingered. In the evenings, the family gathered for a simple meal, bread dipped in olive oil, figs, perhaps fish grilled over coals. Religion bound the city together. Each polis had its patron deity, Athena for Athens, Apollo for Delphi, Artemis for Ephesus. Festivals were held to honor them, processions, sacrifices, and plays. These celebrations were not solemn, but joyful. Music filled the air, wine flowed freely, and citizens danced in the streets. In honoring their gods, they also affirmed their community. Yet beneath this harmony ran competition, a quiet fire that drove the Greeks to excel. Cities measured themselves against one another in art, trade, and war. From this spirit of rivalry came the Olympic Games, held every 4 years at Olympia. Here, athletes from across Greece met not as enemies, but as equals. For a few days, even wars paused. Victors received no gold, only an olive crown and eternal fame. To win was to bring honor to one's city and family. The structure of the polis shaped the mind as much as the body. Men were expected to participate in public life, to speak, to vote, to serve as soldiers. Freedom came with responsibility. The understanding that one's fate was tied to the city. Women, though excluded from politics, held power within the home. They managed estates, oversaw servants, raised children, and tended the household gods. Their influence, though quiet, shaped generations. Trade routes linked the cities by sea. Ships sailed from Piraeus to Rhodes, from Corinth to Syracuse, their holds full of olive oil, pottery, and bronze. In return came grain from Egypt, timber from Macedonia, silver from Spain. The Greeks became masters of navigation, mapping stars and currents, turning the Aegean into a web of exchange. In the hills, new colonies continued to sprout, each a fragment of Greece transplanted onto foreign soil. They spread not only goods, but language, art, and ideals. Greek became the tongue of merchants and thinkers across the Mediterranean. In this network of independent yet connected cities, an extraordinary civilization took root, one that would teach the world the meaning of freedom, reason, and beauty. To walk through a polis was to feel this balance of order and chaos. The streets were narrow, uneven, alive with voices. You might pass a sculptor chiseling marble in the shade of his shop, or a philosopher arguing beneath an olive tree. Donkeys brayed, children shouted, and somewhere a flute played above the hum. Life was immediate, intense, and public. And in the evening, as torches flickered and the sun sank beyond the harbor, the people gathered in small groups. They spoke of harvests, of the latest decree, of the gods' favor. They did not yet know that their experiment, this fragile arrangement of voices and laws, would one day inspire the constitutions of entire continents. To them, it was simply the right way to live, to belong, to speak, to take part. The polis was more than a city. It was a mirror of the human heart, proud, flawed, brilliant, and endlessly striving. And beneath the endless blue of the Greek sky, that heart began to beat louder, preparing to echo across the centuries. Part 6. Life among the city-states. By the time the polis had taken root across the Greek world, life within its walls had settled into a rhythm as old as the olive trees surrounding it. It was a rhythm of sunlight and labor, worship and rest, argument and laughter, a civilization unfolding through countless small routines. If you wandered through a Greek city at dawn, you would not see kings or armies first. You would see people living in the delicate balance between duty and desire, tradition and curiosity. The streets were narrow, paved with stone and dust. Doors opened onto courtyards where fig trees grew beside clay jars filled with rainwater. Women swept thresholds with bundles of reeds, while the smell of baking bread drifted from clay ovens. The city awoke not to trumpets, but to the soft clatter of pottery and the murmur of neighbors greeting one another in the morning light. In every polis, life began with the hearth, the sacred center of each home. It was more than a fireplace. It was the family's link to Hestia, goddess of the hearth and protector of domestic harmony. A small flame was kept burning there day and night. Around it, families gathered to share meals, tell stories, and offer thanks. The humblest fisherman and the richest merchant alike depended on that steady glow. Greek homes were modest by modern standards, whitewashed walls, wooden beams, earthen floors. Furniture was sparse, low stools, woven mats, small tables. Yet each home had beauty in its simplicity. Painted pottery lined the shelves, fresh herbs hung from rafters, a jug of oil caught the morning sun. The boundary between art and necessity barely existed. Even the most practical objects, a cup, a lamp, a spindle, carried grace in their shape. Outside, the agora stirred to life. Merchants unrolled cloth dyed in brilliant purples and reds. Farmers led donkeys laden with grapes and figs. Fishmongers called out the names of their catch in rough, musical voices. Bronze smiths worked in open workshops, the ring of hammers mingling with the chatter of buyers. Among them walked philosophers and poets, craftsmen and slaves, each playing their part in the intricate dance of the city. The Greeks valued order, yet their streets were alive with argument. A citizen might stop in mid-stride to debate a law or praise a new play. Politics was not distant, it was personal. The assembly met often, sometimes under the open sky. Men discussed taxation, military service, or religious rites, and every voice mattered, at least among those considered citizens. To speak well was a civic duty, and rhetoric became an art form as refined as sculpture or music. In Athens, boys from free families began education around the age of 7. Their mornings were spent with grammatists, learning letters and reciting the verses of Homer. They copied lines onto wax tablets, the stylus scratching softly as they learned the rhythm of their language. In the afternoons they trained in the palaestra, the wrestling ground, to strengthen body and spirit alike. Music lessons followed, lyre, flute, or song, for the Greeks believed harmony was essential to virtue. Girls, meanwhile, learned within the home. Their mothers taught them to weave, to manage the household, to oversee servants, and to honor the gods. Women's lives were private yet essential. They tended the domestic sphere, ensuring the city's stability through care and continuity. A good wife was one who kept her house in order, reared strong children, and managed resources wisely. And though few were named in the annals of history, the rhythm of Greek life depended upon them. Meals were simple, but shared with ceremony. Breakfast might be barley bread dipped in wine, supper, lentils or cheese, olives, and fruit. On special occasions, weddings, festivals, or sacrifices, tables filled with roasted lamb, honey cakes, and fresh fish grilled over open flames. Wine was always mixed with water. To drink it pure was a sign of barbarism. Even pleasure had its rules. Entertainment came through conversation and performance. In the evenings, friends gathered for a symposium, literally drinking together. Reclining on couches, they drank from painted cups while discussing poetry, politics, or the meaning of virtue. Musicians played, and laughter echoed into the night. Yet even this leisure was tinged with philosophy. The Greeks sought moderation in all things, the balance between excess and restraint they called sophrosin. Religious life filled the calendar. Each month brought festivals honoring different gods, Dionysia for wine and theater, Panathenaea for Athena, and countless local feasts where citizens paraded with garlands and torches. Sacrifices were offered, prayers recited, and dramas performed in open theaters under the sky. For the Greeks, worship was not separate from joy. It was celebration itself, the recognition that life, however brief, was sacred. Across the Aegean, travelers carried goods and stories between cities. Sailors steered by constellations, guided by stars, they named after heroes and beasts. The sea linked rather than divided them. To a Greek, it was the road between homes. A merchant from Miletus could trade in Sicily and still feel among kin. Language, faith, and custom bound them together more tightly than any empire could. And yet, life was not without hardship. Disease, drought, and war were constant threats. A poor harvest could mean famine. A single raid could destroy a village. But the Greeks faced adversity with a stubborn pride born of centuries of struggle. They believed that to live well was not to avoid suffering, but to meet it with dignity. A person's worth lay in how they bore misfortune, a belief that would later echo through their tragedies and philosophies alike. As twilight fell, lamps flickered in the doorways, casting amber light across the cobbled streets. Somewhere, a child practiced his letters. Somewhere else, an old woman whispered a prayer to Hera. The air smelled of olive oil and smoke, of salt carried inland from the sea. From a rooftop, you could see the constellations that guided the ancestors of these people centuries ago: Orion, Cassiopeia, the Great Bear, unchanged and eternal. This was everyday life in ancient Greece, ordinary, sacred, human, a world of conversation and craft, faith and festival, bound by the belief that beauty could be found in all things, even in the simplest gesture. From these humble rhythms, the Greeks built a civilization that would one day teach the world how to live with both reason and grace. And as the lamps burned low, the city slept, not in silence, but in contentment. The sea whispered just beyond the walls, carrying dreams to every shore, touched by the same moonlight. Part 7. Cloth, Craft, and Color. Morning sunlight spilled over the rooftops of the Greek city-states, painting the streets in gold and clay red. The world stirred once more, merchants setting out their wares, women drawing water from fountains, artisans opening their workshops where dust and dreams mingled in equal measure. Ancient Greece was not only a civilization of thinkers and warriors, it was a civilization of makers, people who shaped the tangible world with patient hands and steady minds. Everywhere, color. The Greeks loved it, on walls, on cloth, on statues that we now imagine white, but once gleamed in bright pigments of blue, red, and ochre. Life in the polis was full of texture and hue. The sound of the loom was as familiar as the cry of gulls by the harbor. The sight of pottery drying in the sun was as ordinary as the scent of oil and thyme drifting from kitchens. Let us begin with clothing, the skin of civilization. Greek garments were simple in shape, yet graceful in movement. Men wore the chiton, a rectangular piece of wool or linen wrapped and fastened with pins on the shoulders, falling in soft folds to the knees or ankles. Women's chitons were longer, often belted high under the breast, their fabric dyed in gentle tones, saffron yellow, sea blue, wine red. Over these they draped the himation, a cloak or shawl that shifted elegantly as they walked. Each fold was deliberate. There were no seams or tailoring. Beauty emerged from how the fabric was worn. The wealthy might wear linen from Egypt, cool and smooth in summer. Others spun coarse wool, warm and practical. Dyes came from the land and sea, purple from shellfish, red from madder root, yellow from saffron. To dress was to participate in nature's palette, to turn labor into grace. The act of weaving held sacred meaning. In courtyards and shaded rooms, women sat at tall looms, guiding threads through threads, their hands tracing patterns passed down through generations. The sound of the shuttle, soft, rhythmic, endless, filled Greek homes like a heartbeat. Spinning wool was not merely domestic work, it was devotion, a ritual of order against chaos. The goddess Athena herself was patron of weavers, embodying wisdom in both mind and craft. Men's crafts, too, carried the same reverence. The potter's workshop was a place of creation and meditation. On his wheel, clay transformed from formless earth into vessel, amphora, crater, kylix, each shape serving both art and utility. Some held wine, others oil or grain. Some were destined for temples, others for graves. Their surfaces told stories, battles, banquets, and the quiet moments of life. A child reaching for a bird, a woman playing a lyre, a god watching from afar. In the glow of the kiln, fire hardened these scenes into immortality. The potter's signature, scratched discreetly at the base, was not vanity but faith, faith that beauty might outlast its maker. And it did. In the foundries, the blacksmith's fire roared. Bronze and iron melted, sparks rising like brief stars. Helmets, plowshares, and jewelry emerged from flame, shaped by blows that echoed through alleys and mountainsides. Metalwork was the meeting of violence and precision. The same skill that forged a sword could also shape a delicate pin or a mirror S-frame. Stone, too, became language. Sculptors studied the human body with almost spiritual devotion, believing proportion and symmetry reflected divine order. Their chisels carved not only flesh, but thought, serene faces, calm gestures, quiet strength. The statues were painted, adorned, and set in temples or courtyards, where sunlight moved across their features like living breath. Through marble, the Greeks sought permanence in a world of change. And then there was color on walls. The interiors of homes, often plain from outside, bloomed with painted scenes inside, vines curling across plaster, birds perched among flowers, mythic creatures half hidden in shadow. Even small houses bore signs of care, a decorated cup, a patterned border, a handful of wild herbs drying in a jar. Beauty was not a luxury, it was a necessity, a reflection of the Greek conviction that harmony should exist in all things. Marketplaces were mosaics of craft. Basket makers wove reeds into shapes that breathed. Shoemakers stitched leather by lamplight. Jewelers worked with gold, amber, and glass, creating ornaments shaped like leaves and serpents. A well-made object was not admired merely for cost, but for technique, the mastery of craft that connected mortal effort to divine inspiration. Every artisan, however humble, was in conversation with the gods. These crafts fed the city's soul as much as its economy. Pottery carried grain across seas. Armor defended its walls. Fabrics clothed its citizens in dignity. Even in poverty, a Greek sought elegance in proportion, simplicity in form. To be Greek was to seek balance between necessity and beauty, the point where use becomes art. For the poor, life was still labor. Farmers patched their tunics with rough stitches, fishermen mended nets by lantern light. But even among them, one found artistry, a rope coiled neatly, a pot repaired with care, a pattern etched onto a tool's handle. The instinct to beautify survived hardship, as though the gods themselves whispered that form and order were humanity, as answer to the uncertainty of fate. When festivals came, the city bloomed. Women wore wreaths of laurel, men donned bright cloaks, and dancers moved through the streets in fabrics that shimmered like flame. Music and craft fused in celebration. Flutes trilled, sandals struck the stones in rhythm, garlands brushed against painted walls. The same hands that worked for survival now lifted offerings to the gods, proud and grateful. At dusk, when work was done, artisans washed their hands in cool water and watched the sun fade behind the hills. Smoke from hearths mingled with the scent of crushed olives and clay dust. The day's labors, ephemeral yet eternal, lingered in every finished bowl and folded cloth. Tomorrow would begin again, new thread, new pot, new spark from the forge. And through these daily acts of making, the Greeks achieved something greater than empire. They created continuity. Their world endured because they poured their souls into the materials of life. Every vessel, every cloak, every carving was a quiet declaration that in the fleetingness of existence, beauty was the surest form of remembrance. Part 8. Faith in Stone and Sky. Religion in ancient Greece was not a doctrine. It was a way of seeing the world. It was the breath between wind and wave, the shimmer of light on marble, the rustle of olive leaves when no one was near. The Greeks did not separate the sacred from the everyday. To them, divinity was everywhere, in the thunder above, in the soil beneath their feet, in the warmth of a hearth's flame. Every city-state honored its own patron god, yet all shared the same pantheon, the 12 great Olympians who dwelled, at least in imagination, atop snow-covered Mount Olympus. There sat Zeus, king of gods and keeper of storms, beside Hera, his queen and guardian of marriage. Poseidon ruled the sea, Athena the mind, Apollo the light, Artemis the hunt, Demeter the harvest, Aphrodite love and beauty. Around them circled a multitude of lesser spirits, nymphs of trees and rivers, muses of song, demons of luck and mischief. To the Greeks, these beings were not distant abstractions. They were companions, rivals, witnesses. A fisherman might pray to Poseidon for calm waters. A shepherd might whisper thanks to Pan for protecting his flock. A traveler, setting out at dawn, would pour a drop of wine onto the earth before stepping onto the road. The gods were as close as one's shadow, as capricious as the sea, and as enduring as the stars. Temples rose wherever devotion gathered. At first they were simple, wooden columns, thatched roofs, altars of uncut stone. Over time, they became the most enduring symbols of Greek faith. Temples of marble, built not for shelter, but for presence. Their proportions followed sacred geometry, each column and pediment designed to echo the order of the cosmos. Even the smallest shrine carried that same grace, a belief that harmony itself was divine. Within the temple stood the cult statue, the physical embodiment of the god. Some were life-sized, others colossal, faces serene, eyes distant, forms clothed in gold and ivory. The smell of incense and oil filled the air. Offerings were laid at their feet, bread, honey, flowers, or coins. The faithful did not enter to worship as in later religions. Rather, they remained outside, under the open sky, where the god could see them as they were. Each polis held festivals that tied community to the divine. In Athens, the Panathenea celebrated Athena with processions, sacrifices, and games. Citizens marched together through streets lined with garlands, bearing woven robes for their goddess. In Delphi, pilgrims climbed the mountain to consult the oracle of Apollo, a priestess who inhaled the vapors of the earth and spoke in riddles. Kings and farmers alike came seeking her words, believing that the voice of the god spoke through human breath. Elsewhere, in Eleusis, initiates gathered for the mysteries of Demeter, secret rituals promising rebirth after death. What happened there was never written down, but those who experienced it spoke of transformation, of a peace that lingered for life. In Dionysian festivals, the god of wine and ecstasy blurred the boundaries between mortal and divine. Masks, music, and dance turned worship into theater, giving birth to tragedy itself. Every aspect of Greek religion reflected a single truth, that humanity and divinity mirrored one another. The gods were powerful but flawed. The people were mortal but luminous. This symmetry comforted the Greeks. They did not pray for salvation, but for balance, a world where harvest followed winter, justice followed pride, and joy followed sorrow. Even death was woven into this cycle. The Greeks believed the soul journeyed to the underworld, a shadowed realm ruled by Hades. It was not heaven nor hell, but continuation, a place of memory and rest. The living honored their dead with small offerings, honey cakes, libations, wreaths of myrtle. Tombs were built beside roads so travelers would remember those who came before. To forget a name was the truest death. Faith was also expressed through art and architecture, the sculptor capturing the calm of Apollo, the poet describing the blush of dawn, the philosopher searching for order. All were acts of devotion. For the Greeks, beauty and goodness were inseparable. They called this unity kalokagathia, the harmony of the moral and the aesthetic. To create beauty was to honor the gods, to seek understanding was to approach them. Daily life revolved around these quiet rituals. A woman baking bread might set aside the first loaf for Hestia. A sailor departing port would tie a small figurine to his mast for luck. Farmers blessed their fields before the plow touched soil, believing Demeter walked unseen among the furrows. Children learned the names of the gods before they learned their own. Yet beneath this piety was curiosity, the beginning of philosophy. The Greeks loved their gods, but also questioned them. How could perfection possess jealousy? How could fate coexist with free will? These questions did not destroy faith. They refined it. Slowly, myth became metaphor, and reverence evolved into reflection. In seeking to understand the divine, the Greeks began to understand themselves. The temples of stone still stand today, silent and luminous. Tourists walk where priests once burned offerings, where hymns once echoed against marble walls. Time has worn their colors away, but not their meaning. Each column still holds the balance of heaven and earth, geometry made sacred, order made visible. At twilight, when the last rays of the sun strike the white marble of the Parthenon, the stone glows with a warmth that seems almost alive. It is as if the ancient gods still linger there, not as rulers, but as memories of how humans once saw the world, not through fear, but through wonder. And as the night deepens over the Aegean, one can almost imagine the old prayers rising again, carried by the wind, words of gratitude, of humility, of awe. Faith in Greece was never about certainty. It was about the endless conversation between the mortal and the eternal, between stone and sky. Part 9. Athens Awakens. The world had learned to speak again, to shape and to pray. But now it was time for it to think. Among all the Greek city-states, one began to burn brighter than the rest. Athens, a city of hills and harbors, of fishermen and philosophers, of builders and dreamers. It was here that the restless Greek mind began its greatest experiment, the invention of democracy and the birth of thought as a civic duty. The story of Athens began not in glory but in struggle. The land of Attica was rocky and thin-soiled, its farmers weary of drought and debt. In the early centuries, power lay in the hands of aristocrats, men born to privilege who ruled through lineage and wealth. Ordinary citizens, unable to repay their loans, often fell into slavery. The city teetered between famine and revolt. Then came Solon, a poet and statesman chosen to untangle this knot of despair. He walked the streets, listening to merchants and farmers, to widows and elders. He saw that tyranny was not born from malice, but from imbalance. And so, with words and reason, he rewrote the laws of Athens. He cancelled debts, freed the enslaved, and declared that no Athenian should ever be owned by another. His reforms gave voice to the common man and replaced bloodline with merit. Solon's system was imperfect, fragile, but revolutionary. It allowed citizens, all free men of Athenian birth, to serve in assemblies, to speak and to vote. It planted the idea that power could belong not to one, but to many. When his work was done, Solon departed Athens, leaving the people to test the gift he had given them. They would stumble, fight, and nearly lose it more than once, but the seed had been planted. In the century that followed, new leaders rose and fell. Pisistratus, a cunning aristocrat, seized power but ruled with a surprising fairness. He commissioned temples, improved roads, and supported poets and artisans. Under him, Athens began to prosper, and the arts flourished like vines after rain. When his dynasty fell, another reformer stepped forward, Cleisthenes, whose vision completed what Solon began. He reorganized Athens into tribes not by birth, but by region, ensuring that power was shared across classes and families. The assembly became the heart of the city, where every citizen could raise his hand and shape the future. The word democratia, rule by the people, was born. It was messy, loud, and fragile, but it was alive. The Athenians argued endlessly, sometimes wisely, sometimes foolishly, but they believed that to argue was better than to obey. Their system depended on participation. Silence was the one unforgivable sin. Daily life in this new Athens hummed with purpose. At dawn, farmers brought goods into the agora, filling the air with the smell of fresh bread and olives. Philosophers gathered in shaded colonnades to debate the nature of justice or the soul. Stonemasons worked on temples that rose higher than any before, their chisels singing against marble. Citizens hurried to the assembly on the Nix Hill, where speeches echoed across the city like waves. Not everyone shared equally in this freedom. Women remained confined to their homes, their lives centered around the hearth and family. Foreigners, though welcome in trade, were denied the rights of citizenship. Slaves, whether captured in war or born into bondage, served in workshops and households. Yet even with these limits, the idea that ordinary men could govern themselves was a spark that would one day ignite the world. Religion and politics still walked hand in hand. The goddess Athena, who gave the city her name, was seen as its protector, the embodiment of wisdom, strategy, and reason. Her owl watched over the Acropolis, her olive tree shaded the sacred ground. Each year, during the Panathenaic festival, Athenians honored her with music, games, and processions. A great robe, woven by the city's women, was carried to her temple in thanks. Art, too, began to flourish in tandem with liberty. Architects learned to balance stone and air, creating structures that seemed to breathe. Sculptors pursued the perfect form, not as imitation, but as truth, the human body rendered in divine proportion. Potters painted scenes of mythology and daily life, preserving moments of joy, toil, and reflection. In theaters built into the hillsides, playwrights wove stories of gods and men, laughter and loss. The city became a mirror of human experience, both sacred and flawed. Athens' strength was not in armies or walls, but in ideas. While Sparta drilled its sons in obedience, Athens taught its citizens to question. Teachers like Anaxagoras and Pythagoras searched for the patterns of the universe. Astronomers charted the stars. Mathematicians discovered proportion. Physicians sought natural causes for illness. Each act of inquiry was a kind of faith, belief in the power of the mind to uncover order within chaos. Even commerce reflected this spirit of openness. Ships sailed from Piraeus to distant ports, carrying oil, pottery, and silver. Merchants returned with grain from Egypt, spices from the east, and stories from lands beyond the horizon. The Athenian coin, stamped with Athena's owl, became a symbol of trust across the Mediterranean. And yet, beneath this brilliance, there was always fragility. Democracy demanded vigilance. Freedom was exhausting. Factions quarreled, demagogues rose, and the balance between wealth and virtue wavered. Still, through all its trials, Athens continued to believe in argument, in beauty, in the dignity of participation. At sunset, the Acropolis glowed with golden light. From the agora below, the hum of conversation drifted upward like incense. The city was imperfect, but alive in every sense. It was no longer a place of kings or conquerors. It was a community of voices, sometimes discordant, sometimes harmonious, bound by the conviction that truth could be found through speech and justice through reason. That conviction would soon be tested. Across the eastern sea, a vast empire was stirring, one that looked upon the small, quarrelsome cities of Greece with both curiosity and threat. The Persians were coming, and in the face of that storm, Athens would discover whether her newborn freedom could survive the winds of war. Part 10. The Spartan Way. While Athens hummed with the noise of debate and artistry, far to the south another city walked a different path, silent, disciplined, and unbending. Sparta, built in the valley of the Eurotas River, was unlike any other place in Greece. It had no grand marketplaces, no crowded harbors, no marble temples glittering in the sun. Its beauty was not in ornament, but in order. To the Spartans, freedom meant strength, and strength meant obedience. They lived simply, ate plainly, and trained constantly. Everything in Sparta existed to serve the state, and everything the state did was to prepare its citizens for endurance. Theirs was not a culture of words but of deeds. While Athenians asked questions, Spartans answered them with action. Long before Athens dreamed of democracy, Sparta had faced its own struggle. Surrounded by mountains and fertile land, it conquered its neighbors, the Messenians, turning them into helots, state-owned serfs who worked the fields and produced the food that sustained Sparta's warriors. To prevent rebellion, the Spartans hardened themselves, transforming their society into a permanent camp, a living army. From the moment of birth, A Spartan's life was decided by the needs of the city. Infants were examined by elders. Those deemed weak or sickly were left to die on the slopes of Mount Taygetus. It was brutal, but to the Spartans, mercy lay in strength. They believed that the survival of the whole required the sacrifice of the few. Boys entered the agoge, the state's training system, at the age of 7. There they learned endurance, stealth, and discipline. They were given one cloak for the year, slept on reeds, and stole food to survive. But if caught, they were beaten not for stealing, but for failing to hide it well. The agoge was not cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was designed to make boys cunning and self-reliant. By adolescence, they moved as one, silent, graceful, lethal. Education in Sparta was not of letters, but of loyalty. A boy's closest family was his cohort, his greatest honor, obedience, yet bonds of friendship and love ran deep within these groups. Brotherhood was sacred, for a Spartan's life depended on the man beside him. Courage was not facing death alone, but standing firm in the line. Girls in Sparta lived differently than in other Greek cities. They were trained in running, wrestling, and javelin, strong in body to bear strong children. They ate the same food as men, spoke freely, and managed estates, while their husbands served in the army. Foreigners often remarked on Spartan women's confidence, their directness, their refusal to be silent. Only Spartan women, one said, give birth to real men. When a boy reached 20, he joined the ranks of the Spartiates, full citizens and professional soldiers. They lived together in barracks, dining on black broth, a simple stew of pork, vinegar, and blood. Luxury was despised, simplicity was revered. Their hair was long, their speech short, their movements measured. They were trained not to boast or to weep. The highest praise a Spartan could receive was that he had acted as he should. War to the Spartans was not chaos but art. Their phalanx, a wall of shields and spears moving as one, was nearly invincible. Each man's shield protected the man beside him. To lose it was the deepest shame. In battle, they advanced to the sound of flutes, calm and relentless. Their courage was collective, a single will forged from thousands of lives. Sparta's government was as balanced as its citizens. 2 kings ruled jointly, one leading in war, the other presiding at home. Beneath them, the Gerousia, a council of elders, guided policy with the wisdom of age, while the ephors, 5 elected overseers, enforced the laws and watched even the kings. The system valued equilibrium, a harmony between monarchy, oligarchy, and democracy, though always tilted toward control. Life for the Helots, however, was harsh. They toiled in the fields from dawn to dusk, feeding those who ruled them. Each year, the Spartans declared a symbolic war on their own slaves, allowing young warriors to kill any who resisted. It was a shadow that darkened Sparta's ideal, a reminder that its perfection rested on fear. Yet the Spartans believed they were preserving something sacred, order in a chaotic world. Their simplicity kept greed at bay. Their discipline prevented decay. While other cities squabbled over trade and art, Sparta remained constant, like iron in fire. Visitors described it as austere, but strangely beautiful, a place where silence spoke of purpose. Festivals were rare, but powerful. The Gymnopedia, the festival of naked youth, celebrated strength and unity through dance. The Carnea, honoring Apollo, combined military drills with ritual feasting. Even their religion reflected their values. Their gods were not distant patrons of luxury, but embodiments of discipline, courage, and endurance. Spartan mothers were said to hand their sons their shields before battle with the words, "with it," or "on it." It was not cruelty, but pride, a reminder that the greatest glory was to die in service to the city, and when death came, there was no wailing, only quiet acceptance. Tombstones bore few inscriptions, the names of men who died in war and women who died in childbirth. the two acts that gave life to Sparta. The city had little art, few monuments, and no interest in fame, yet its influence was immense. It embodied an ideal that fascinated even its enemies, that discipline could be a form of beauty, that restraint could be power. The Spartans left behind no libraries, no philosophers, no epics, but they left a legend. In time, Sparta would stand beside Athens against the Persian tide, and later face her across the battlefield. Their rivalry would define an age, two visions of humanity locked in a struggle as eternal as thought and action themselves. But for now, as the moon rose over the quiet plains of Laconia, Sparta slept in perfect order. No laughter, no argument, no fear, only the soft whisper of the river and the faint gleam of bronze in the torchlight. A city dreaming not of freedom or wealth, but of strength. Part 11. Against the east wind, across the Aegean Sea, beyond the blue horizon, stretched an empire that seemed endless, Persia, a realm of kings who ruled from the Indus to the Nile, where messengers rode on royal roads and gold flowed like rivers. Its armies were vast, its cities radiant, its rulers accustomed to obedience. And yet, in the early 5th century BCE, this mighty empire turned its gaze toward the small, quarrelsome cities of Greece, tiny sparks of freedom flickering on the edge of its dominion. The clash that followed would not merely shape borders, it would define ideas, tyranny and liberty, obedience and reason, empire and the individual. It began, as many great storms do, with a single defiance. In 499 BCE, the Greek cities of Ionia, along the coast of Asia Minor, rose in rebellion against Persian rule. Athens, newly confident in her democracy, sent ships and men to help. Together, they burned the Persian city of Sardis, a bold act that carried far beyond its flames. When word reached King Darius the Great, he is said to have called for a servant to remind him each day, "Master, remember the Athenians." Retribution came swiftly. In 490 BCE, Persian ships crossed the Aegean and landed on the plain of Marathon, a stretch of sand and wind north of Athens. Facing them were barely 10,000 Greeks, farmers and potters, merchants and soldiers, their armor glinting under the same sun that shone on the invaders' bronze. They fought not for empire, but for their homes. When the battle came, the Athenians charged across the plain, their shields locked, their cries echoing like thunder. Against all odds, they broke the Persian line and drove the invaders back to their ships. It was a victory that seemed impossible, and yet it happened. The legend says a runner named Phidippides raced from Marathon to Athens, 26 miles beneath the burning sun, to bring the news of triumph before collapsing with his last breath. His final word was a single cry, "We have won." But victory did not bring peace. The Persians would return, greater than before. Darius died, but his son Xerxes vowed to avenge him. In 480 BCE, a decade later, he gathered an army so vast that it seemed to drink rivers dry. Bridges were built across the Hellespont, roads carved through mountains. The east wind carried the sound of marching feet, hundreds of thousands of soldiers, chariots, and ships moving toward Greece. In the face of this enormity, the Greek cities did something rare. They united. Sparta took command of the land forces, Athens the sea. For once, rivals stood side by side. The defense of freedom had become a sacred duty. At a narrow mountain pass called Thermopylae, a small force awaited the Persian advance, 7,000 Greeks, including 300 Spartans under their king Leonidas. The path was so narrow that only a few men could fight at once, nullifying the enemy's numbers. For 3 days they held the line, spears shattered, shields splintered, and the air filled with dust and death. When the Persians finally flanked them through a hidden trail, Leonidas dismissed most of the army, staying behind with his Spartans and a few allies. They fought to the last man, their bodies forming a wall of defiance. Thermopylae was a defeat, but it became legend. Even the Persians, it is said, admired the courage of those who chose death over surrender. The delay allowed the Greek fleet, under Athenian leadership, to regroup at Salamis, a narrow strait near the city itself. As Xerxes watched from his golden throne on the shore, his fleet filled the waters, hundreds of ships gleaming in the sun. The Greeks, outnumbered and cornered, waited for the tide. Then, at dawn, they struck. The smaller, faster Athenian triremes darted between the massive Persian vessels, ramming and boarding them. The sea became chaos, oars snapping, sails burning, men shouting prayers to gods who could no longer be heard over the crash of wood and wave. By nightfall, the Persian fleet was broken. Xerxes fled back to Asia, leaving a remnant of his army to continue the fight. A year later, at Plataea, the Greeks met the Persians once more. Spartans, Athenians, and allies united. The battle raged across fields and hills until, at last, the invaders were driven from Greece. The east wind had come, and Greece had stood firm. When peace finally returned, the Greeks did not see themselves as victors of a mere war. They saw themselves as defenders of a principle, that no man should kneel, that no voice should be silenced, that courage and freedom were worth any sacrifice. For the first time, they felt a shared identity beyond their city walls. They called themselves Hellenes, one people, many cities, bound by language and memory. In Athens, triumph became vision. The city, nearly destroyed, rose again with new energy. Its citizens believed their courage had earned them a sacred duty, to build a world worthy of the gods. Gaze. Marble replaced wood, reason replaced superstition, art replaced fear. The Athenian Empire began to form, not through conquest alone, but through influence, through culture, trade, and ideas. But even in victory, shadows lingered. The Spartans mistrusted Athenian ambition. The allies who once fought side by side began to whisper of betrayal and pride. The seed of rivalry was already sown. For now, though, Greece basked in the afterglow of unity. The temples gleamed brighter, the theaters grew larger, and the voices of poets and philosophers rose like a chorus over the land. The world had seen many empires win battles through might. Greece had won through will. And as the waves rolled once more across the Aegean, carrying songs of Marathon, and Thermopylae, the people believed they had proven something eternal, that the human spirit, though small, could defy the vastness of kings. Part 12. The Age of Pericles. When the smoke of war cleared, and the Persian threat faded beyond the horizon, the Greek world stood transformed. The victories at Marathon, Salamis, and Plataea had done more than defend the land. They had awakened its soul. Among all the cities that shared in the triumph, Athens emerged as the heart of a new era, a place where marble, music, and reason fused into what later ages would call the Golden Age. At its center stood one man, Pericles. Tall, calm, deliberate in speech, he embodied the Athenian ideal, a citizen statesman, philosopher, and visionary. Under his leadership, Athens entered its most luminous century. It was not the wealth of kings or the spoils of empire that made it glorious, but an idea that art, thought, and civic life could together shape perfection. When Pericles spoke in the assembly, the people listened. His words were measured, yet alive with conviction. "We do not copy our neighbors," he said. "We are an example to them." And indeed, Athens had become something the world had never seen, a democracy confident enough to adorn itself with beauty, to see philosophy as its defense, and creativity as its destiny. The rebuilding began upon the Acropolis, the sacred rock that had been ravaged by the Persians. Out of its ashes rose the Parthenon, a temple so precise in proportion that even its columns curved subtly inward, compensating for the tricks of the eye. designed by Ictinus and Callicrates, adorned by the sculptor Phidias. It was both a home for Athena and a hymn to human craftsmanship. Inside stood her colossal statue, gold and ivory gleaming in torchlight, her gaze serene and unyielding. From the Acropolis, marble dust drifted over the city like snow. Stonemasons worked in rhythm, their hammers ringing like music. Architects measured the heavens to guide their lines. Sculptors studied the human body with a devotion once reserved for gods. The streets below echoed with poets rehearsing verses, painters grinding pigments, and philosophers arguing over the nature of virtue. Every sound became part of the city's harmony. Athens under Pericles was alive with voices. The agora thrummed each morning with commerce and conversation. Fishmongers shouting prices beside teachers debating ethics. Public life was everywhere, in the assembly, on the Pnyx, where thousands gathered to vote, in the law courts where citizens judged one another's disputes, in the theaters carved into the hills where stories of gods and mortals taught the city about itself. It was during this time that drama reached its height. Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides turned myth into mirror, revealing the inner struggles of pride, guilt, and fate. The tragedies performed at the theater of Dionysus were not merely entertainment, they were civic reflection. Citizens watched actors in masks recite lines about justice, hubris, and mercy, and left questioning their own lives. Even comedy flourished, as playwrights like Aristophanes dared to mock the powerful, proof that laughter too was a form of freedom. Education blossomed. Boys studied music, geometry, and philosophy. Men gathered in the gymnasia, where physical strength and mental grace were seen as one. The sophists, wandering teachers, taught rhetoric and reason, while a barefoot thinker named Socrates began to wander the streets, asking questions that no one could easily answer. What is virtue? He would ask a soldier. What is beauty? He would ask a sculptor. He claimed to know nothing, yet his questions changed everything. The arts flourished because they were woven into daily life. Every building, every vase, every law reflected the pursuit of balance, sophrosyne, moderation, and arete, excellence. The Greeks did not separate the aesthetic from the ethical. To live beautifully was to live well. Under Pericles, Athens also expanded her influence overseas. The Delian League, once an alliance against Persia, became an Athenian empire in all but name. Tribute from allied cities flowed into her treasury, funding fleets and temples alike. Her ships patrolled the seas, her silver coins bore the owl of Athena, her culture spread like light. But with pride came resentment. The Spartans and their allies, wary of Athenian power, watched and waited. Inside the city, however, Pericles sought unity. He commissioned public works that employed thousands, ensuring that even the poorest citizens shared in the city's renewal. He introduced pay for jurors, enabling the lower classes to serve in civic roles. The result was astonishing: a society where the builder, the artist, and the philosopher each saw themselves as custodians of something greater, the shared ideal of Athens itself. At night, the Acropolis shone like a crown above the city, torches reflecting off marble, the air thick with the scent of olive smoke and sea wind. Citizens strolled along colonnades, discussing politics or poetry. Musicians played softly in courtyards. Across the water, fishermen could see the temple glowing like a beacon, as if the goddess herself kept watch. It is tempting, from the distance of centuries, to call this a golden age. But for those who lived it, it was simply life. A mason shaping stone for the Parthenon thought only of his next cut. A mother lighting a lamp before Athena thought only of her child's safety. Yet together, their quiet acts built something that would outlast empires. Pericles himself knew the fragility of greatness. In his funeral oration, delivered for the soldiers who fell in war, he spoke not of conquest, but of values. "Our city is open to the world," he said, "and we live freely. trusting not in walls, but in our courage. Those words would echo through history, a definition of democracy, not as structure, but as spirit. The age of Pericles would not last forever. Plague, envy, and conflict waited beyond the horizon. But for one shining generation, the human mind reached a balance it had never known before, where the hand that built a temple also carved a law, where reason and beauty walked hand in hand, and where a city became an idea. And as dawn rose over the Aegean, its light touched marble and sea alike, turning both to gold. The world, for a brief moment, seemed in perfect harmony, and that harmony was Athens. Part 13. Mind and Measure. When the sound of hammers faded from the Acropolis and the marble dust settled, something quieter began to take hold in Athens. A hum, not of tools but of thought. The stones Pericles had raised would one day weather and crumble, but the ideas born beneath them would outlast marble itself. For in the years that followed, Greece discovered not just how to build beautifully, but how to think clearly, to measure the world, to question the unseen, and to define what it means to be human. This was the age of philosophers. Their classrooms were not temples, but open courtyards, gardens, and shaded arcades. Their tools were not chisels or brushes, but words, questions, and silence. Out of their debates arose a new form of worship, one that sought divinity in reason and harmony in truth. It began, as many revolutions do, with a single man, Socrates. Barefoot, poor, and endlessly curious, he wandered the streets of Athens like a question made flesh. He spoke with anyone who would listen, merchants, craftsmen, soldiers, youths, asking not what they owned, but what they believed. What is justice? What is courage? What is the good life? He claimed to know nothing, yet through his questions he forced others to confront what they did not know either. To his followers he was a gadfly, small but impossible to ignore, stinging the city awake. To his critics he was dangerous. His refusal to flatter the powerful and his insistence on truth made him both beloved and feared. Yet Socrates sought no fame. He said that the unexamined life was not worth living, and he lived by that creed until the end. When condemned to death for corrupting the youth and impiety, he drank the cup of hemlock calmly, surrounded by friends. His death, more than his life, became the symbol of Athens' greatest paradox, a free city afraid of its own freedom. Among those who watched him die was a student who would shape philosophy for centuries, Plato. After his teacher's execution, Plato left Athens, disillusioned, and traveled widely, to Egypt, to Sicily, to the schools of mathematicians and mystics. When he returned, he founded his own sanctuary of learning, the Academy, where men gathered to pursue truth without fear. Plato believed that the visible world was only a shadow, that behind every imperfect thing we see lies an ideal form, perfect justice, perfect beauty, perfect goodness. The world of the senses deceived, the world of the mind revealed. In his dialogues, he preserved Socrates' voice, letting it question kings and slaves alike. His words carried the rhythm of conversation, the humility of curiosity. To him, knowledge was not possession, but recollection, a remembering of truths the soul already knew. From Plato's teachings came another student, perhaps the most brilliant of all, Aristotle. Where his master looked to heaven for perfection, Aristotle turned his gaze toward earth. He studied everything: animals, plants, weather, language, politics, logic. He believed truth was not distant but observable, that the universe could be understood through pattern and purpose. All men by nature desire to know, he wrote, and from that desire he built the foundations of science. In his Lyceum, students walked beneath colonnades, discussing causes and essences, classifying every branch of knowledge. To Aristotle, the world was not chaos, but order waiting to be discovered. He spoke of virtue as a mean between extremes, courage between recklessness and cowardice, generosity between waste and greed. Through moderation, the soul could mirror the harmony of the cosmos. The influence of these three, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, was immeasurable. Together they mapped the terrain of the human mind. Socrates taught that truth begins in questioning. Plato, that truth exists beyond the senses. Aristotle, that truth is found within them. Every philosophy that followed was, in some way, a dialogue with these men. But philosophy in Greece was not confined to Athens alone. Across the sea in Ionia, thinkers like Heraclitus and Democritus pondered the nature of reality itself. Heraclitus saw the world as eternal change, a river in which no man could step twice. Democritus imagined that everything, even the soul, was made of invisible atoms swirling in the void. Though their ideas were abstract, their purpose was human, to find peace through understanding. In the schools of Pythagoras, numbers were treated as sacred. To his followers, mathematics was music made visible, proof that the universe itself sang in harmony. Geometry became a form of prayer, a bridge between the measurable and the divine. The search for wisdom shaped every aspect of life. In the gymnasia, where men trained the body, they also trained the mind, discussing ethics between bouts of exercise. In the symposia, after wine had loosened tongues, talk turned to virtue, knowledge, and the soul's immortality. Even the dramatists joined the conversation, turning moral dilemmas into theater. The line between philosophy and art blurred until both became one expression of wonder. These thinkers did not see faith and reason as enemies. The temple and the academy stood side by side, each seeking truth through different means. To question the world was to honor it. To understand nature was to glimpse the divine. It was this balance between reverence and curiosity that made Greek thought timeless. As centuries passed, their questions spread beyond Greece. Alexander the Great, a pupil of Aristotle, would carry their language and learning across continents. Long after Athens' stones had fallen, scholars in distant lands, in Rome, in Byzantium, in Baghdad, in Paris, would still read their words, tracing the roots of science, logic, and ethics back to those sunlit courtyards. If you had walked through Athens in this age, you might have seen Socrates arguing in the marketplace, Plato writing by lamplight, Aristotle examining the veins of a leaf. None could have guessed that they were shaping the blueprint of Western thought. They simply followed curiosity wherever it led. And when night fell over the city, and the stars shone above the silent Parthenon, the same men who studied logic by day would look upward and whisper prayers to the constellations. For all their reason, they never lost their sense of wonder. Thought to them was not rebellion against the gods, it was conversation with them. Part 14. Homes, Food, and Festivals. Behind the marble temples and the philosophers' questions, Greece still breathed through simpler things. The warmth of bread, the rhythm of seasons, the quiet grace of daily life. Civilization might have written its name in stone, but its soul lived in the hum of kitchens, the flicker of lamps, the laughter that echoed through narrow streets. Homes in ancient Greece were humble but alive. From the outside, most were plain. Square walls of sun-baked brick, small doors, few windows. Privacy was prized, beauty kept within. Step inside, and light opened into a courtyard, the heart of every household. Here grew fig trees and herbs, perhaps a small altar to Hestia, goddess of the hearth. A jar of water sat cool in the shade, and children chased each other between clay pots and baskets of olives. Each home was divided by duty. The andron, reserved for men, was where guests were entertained, and wine poured in ceremony. The gynaeconitis, the women's quarters, lay deeper inside, where weaving looms whispered through the afternoon. At the center, the hearth burned endlessly, its flame both sacred and practical, providing warmth, light, and a place to cook. The smoke scented the air with olive wood and thyme. The Greeks ate simply but with joy. Bread, olives, and wine formed the holy trinity of their table. Barley bread, coarse but nourishing, was baked on hot stones and broken by hand. Olive oil, liquid sunlight, was drizzled over vegetables or mixed with herbs and salt. Cheese, figs, and honey completed most meals. Meat was rare, saved for festivals or sacrifices when it was shared among neighbors. Fish, caught in the morning and grilled by dusk, was the taste of the Aegean itself. They ate together, reclining on couches during the evening meal, speaking softly as lamps flickered. Even the humblest dinner carried ritual, a libation of wine to the gods, a prayer for good harvest, a moment of gratitude before the first bite. To eat was to participate in the order of the world. Festivals turned that order into celebration. Nearly every month brought a holy day, a moment when work paused and the city remembered its gods and its joy. These festivals were not quiet affairs. They were the pulse of civic life. The streets filled with color, garlands, and song. Drums beat, flutes trilled, and dancers whirled through clouds of flower petals. The scent of roasted meat and burning incense drifted through the air. At the Panathenaia, the greatest of Athens' festivals, the entire city honored Athena. The young carried torches in races through the streets. Elders sat on marble benches to watch plays and competitions. A great woven robe, embroidered with scenes of gods and heroes, was paraded through the city to the Acropolis, offered to the goddess as thanks for her protection. The people sang hymns, not in silence, but in joyful unity, a chorus of faith and pride. Other cities celebrated their own patrons. At Delphi, the Pythian Games honored Apollo with music and athletic contests. At Olympia, men gathered from across Greece to compete under Zeus's gaze, runners, wrestlers, charioteers. No wars were fought during the games. For a few days, the Greek world was at peace. Victors returned home crowned with olive wreaths, greeted as living symbols of divine favor. The Dionysia, devoted to the god of wine and ecstasy, transformed Athens into a living theater. Citizens wore masks, drank sweet wine, and watched dramas performed under the open sky. Through laughter and tragedy alike, they renewed their connection to the divine, not through solemnity, but through expression. To the Greeks, joy itself was sacred. Even the changing of seasons carried ceremony. In spring, they celebrated the awakening of the earth with songs to Demeter and Persephone, symbols of life's return. In autumn, harvest festivals honored the cycle of death and renewal. Every ritual, every offering, was part of a conversation between humanity and nature, a dialogue carried in grain and smoke, in the fragrance of myrtle and pine. Food and faith intertwined everywhere. Before every meal, wine was poured for the gods. Before every journey, bread was broken with companions. The Greeks believed hospitality, xenia, was divine law. To welcome a stranger was to honor Zeus himself, who watched over travelers and guests. No home was too poor to share what it had. A bowl of fruit, a seat by the fire, a story told in the soft hours before sleep. Children grew up learning these customs as instinct. They watched their mothers knead dough and their fathers offer wine at family altars. They memorized hymns and stories, sang to the harvest moon, and followed processions through the city, holding hands beneath garlands of ivy. Through these rituals, they learned what it meant to be Greek, not a matter of race or blood, but of shared rhythm and reverence. In the countryside, life followed the same gentle cycles. Farmers rose before dawn, led oxen into fields, and worked until the sun hung high. Women fetched water from wells, grinding grain and weaving cloth. In the afternoon heat, the world slowed, a pause for bread, cheese, and olives beneath the shade of an olive tree. In the evening, songs rose across the valleys, shepherds calling to one another as flocks returned home. From city to village, sea to mountain, Greece breathed in patterns of balance, feast and fast, toil and rest, thought and song. The philosophers might debate virtue, the generals plan war, but the ordinary people lived it, not through speeches, but through the quiet dignity of daily life. And when the stars appeared, glimmering above tiled roofs and sleeping fields, families gathered once more around their hearths. Flames danced across painted walls, shadows moved like spirits of ancestors. Bread broke, laughter murmured, and prayers whispered to the dark. In those moments, beneath the same constellations that guided their ships, the Greeks were one people, bound not by empire, but by custom, memory, and the simple joy of being alive. Part 15. The Peloponnesian War, the harmony of Greece, the balance between art, thought, and civic pride, could not last forever. Beneath the songs of festivals and the white gleam of marble, rivalries smoldered like coals beneath ash. The very brilliance of Athens, admired across the world, cast long shadows over its neighbors, and none felt that shadow more keenly than Sparta. Two powers, equal and opposite, one devoted to freedom and intellect, the other to discipline and order, had stood side by side against Persia. But once the enemy was gone, their unity dissolved. Athens, flush with confidence and wealth, expanded her empire, demanding tribute from the cities she had once called allies. Her fleets ruled the Aegean, her silver flowed like a river. Sparta, landlocked and austere, watched in silence. The tension between them grew, slow and inevitable, like the tightening of a bowstring. By 431 BCE, the string snapped. The Peloponnesian War began, a war not of barbarians against Greeks, but of Greeks against themselves. It was the longest and most bitter conflict their world had ever known. The first years belonged to Athens. Behind her long walls, stretching from city to sea, she commanded the greatest navy on earth. Her ships, sleek, three-tiered triremes, glided across the waves like arrows of polished wood and bronze. They raided Spartan coasts, seized islands, and kept trade flowing. Pericles urged patience. The war, he believed, would be won through endurance, not conquest. Sparta could burn fields, but Athens ruled the sea. Yet fate seldom obeys strategy. In the second year of war, a terrible plague swept through Athens. Carried by trade ships, it spread through the crowded city, turning triumph into terror. No offering to Apollo or Asclepius could stop it. Bodies filled the streets, pyres burned day and night. Among the dead was Pericles himself, the steady voice of reason that had guided Athens for decades. His death left a vacuum that demagogues quickly filled. Without him, Athens faltered. The assembly turned impulsive, led by those who shouted loudest. Ambition replaced prudence, anger replaced patience. The war dragged on, sieges, naval battles, betrayals. Across the Aegean, cities were forced to choose sides. Greece, once united in freedom, tore itself apart in fear. Sparta struck through the land, devastating Attica's fields, cutting down orchards that had stood for generations. In revenge, Athenian fleets burned Spartan ports and raided the Peloponnesian coast. The balance of power swayed like a pendulum, one victory followed by another defeat. Towns changed allegiance, friends became foes. Among the Spartans rose a new leader, Brasidas, bold and cunning, who brought the war north into Thrace. His victories proved that discipline could outmatch Athenian daring. Yet when he fell in battle, both sides mourned him. For even amid hatred, Greece still recognized excellence. In Athens, a new voice rose. Alcibiades, brilliant, reckless, and beautiful. A student of Socrates, he possessed both charm and ambition. He persuaded the city to attempt what seemed impossible, an invasion of Sicily, to conquer the great city of Syracuse and extend Athenian power across the western seas. It was a dream of empire, dazzling and doomed. In 415 BCE, the fleet sailed, hundreds of ships, tens of thousands of men. The harbor glittered with torches as the people cheered, believing victory assured. But the campaign ended in disaster. The Syracusans, aided by Spartan generals, trapped the Athenian army in the harbor. Ships burned, soldiers starved. Those who surrendered were sent to die in the stone quarries of Sicily, their cries echoing against the rock. The news reached Athens like a thunderclap. The empire trembled, its treasury emptied, its allies rebelled. Even as Sparta received aid from Persia, Athens refused to yield. She built new fleets, fought new battles, clung to her identity as if defiance itself were life. But war corrodes even ideals. Justice gave way to paranoia, democracy to mob rule. The trial and execution of generals, the banishment of statesmen, all revealed a city devouring itself. In 404 BCE, after nearly 30 years of war, Sparta finally triumphed. The Athenian navy was destroyed, her walls torn down to the sound of Spartan flutes. A garrison was installed, an oligarchy, the 30 tyrants, ruled briefly in terror before democracy, battered but unbroken, returned. The war was over, but its cost was unbearable. Greece emerged exhausted. Fields lay barren, treasuries empty, trust shattered. Thousands were dead, cities ruined, ideals corrupted. The generation that had built the Parthenon now walked among ruins, haunted by memories of what had been. The poets turned from glory to sorrow, the philosophers from politics to the soul. Yet from the ashes, wisdom grew. The Greeks learned that greatness carries its own peril, that power can destroy even the most enlightened city. Their tragedies, once performed as ritual, now mirrored real life, hubris punished by fate, pride brought low by necessity. In losing the war, they discovered the deeper meaning of moderation, and still the spirit endured. Athens rebuilt her walls, reopened her schools, and continued to teach the world how to think. Sparta, though victorious, would soon decline, her rigid order eroded by the very peace she had won. The war had no true victors, only survivors, and from their endurance Greece would find its next chapter. As evening fell over the quiet fields of Attica, the olive trees stood once more in silence. The air smelled of ash and thyme. The gods, who had watched the madness of men, seemed distant now. Yet beneath the ruins, the seeds of renewal waited, as they always had, for the next sunrise. Part 16. The Macedonian Shadow. The long war had left Greece weary, proud, but hollowed. The temples still gleamed in the sun, the philosophers still walked in quiet thought. But the old unity had fractured. City-states that once fought side by side now distrusted one another. Trade had slowed, farms lay abandoned, and the once great voice of Athens carried more sorrow than command. Into this silence of fatigue, from the misty north, another power began to stir. Macedonia, a land of mountains and river valleys, of shepherds and horsemen, had long stood at the edge of the Greek world, dismissed by the southerners as half-barbarian. Yet it shared their tongue and their gods, and in its rugged soil grew a people fierce and practical. The Greeks of the south debated in marble halls, the Macedonians trained beneath open skies. While Athens argued and Sparta remembered, Macedonia prepared. At its head rose Philip II, a man both soldier and strategist, who had spent his youth as a hostage in Thebes. There he learned Greek politics, warfare, and ambition. When he returned to his homeland, he found a kingdom divided and vulnerable. With patience and cunning, he transformed it. He reorganized the army, arming his soldiers with long sarissas, pikes twice the length of a Greek spear. and drilled them into perfect discipline. The Macedonian phalanx moved like a living machine, its spears a forest of death advancing across the field. But Philip was more than a general. He was a diplomat of iron and silk. With gold he bought allies, with marriage he forged bonds, with war he broke resistance. City after city fell under his influence, some by persuasion, others by force. The southern Greeks watched in alarm, yet their rivalries paralyzed them. Athens feared Sparta, Sparta mistrusted Thebes, and while they quarreled, Philip grew stronger. In 338 BCE, their hesitation ended at Chaeronea, a quiet valley in Boeotia. There, the armies of Athens and Thebes united for the last time to defend their independence. Philip's son, a young prince named Alexander, only 18, commanded the Macedonian cavalry. When battle was joined, the boy led a charge that broke the sacred band of Thebes, the finest warriors in Greece, bound by friendship and oath. By sunset, the field was silent. The freedom of the city-states was gone. Philip did not destroy Greece. Instead, he sought to unite it. Orators like Demosthenes thundered against Macedonian domination, warning of tyranny. Yet even he could not deny Philip's genius. The age of independent polis had ended. A new order was rising, one that would stretch far beyond the narrow valleys of Hellas. But fate rarely allows long peace. In 336 BCE, at the height of his power, Philip was assassinated, struck down at a wedding feast by a trusted guard. The motives were tangled: revenge, jealousy, politics, but the result was clear. The throne passed to his son, Alexander, barely 20 years old. Few believed the boy could hold what his father had built. Within months, they would realize their error. Alexander inherited not just an army, but a vision. Where Philip dreamed of uniting Greece, Alexander dreamed of conquering the world. He had been tutored by Aristotle, who taught him philosophy and science, but also the idea that all things could be understood and therefore mastered. In him burned both intellect and fire, a philosopher's mind within a conqueror's heart. When Thebes rebelled after Philip's death, Alexander marched south with terrifying speed. Thebes resisted. Thebes was destroyed. Its walls fell, its people sold into slavery. The message was unmistakable. Greece would follow him or vanish. Athens, trembling, submitted. The League of Corinth renewed its oath, now under the young king's command. Alexander stood upon the hill at Corinth and looked eastward. Beyond the Aegean lay the vast empire of Persia, the same empire that had once burned Greek cities and defied their freedom. For over a century, the Greeks had dreamed of vengeance. Now one man would make it real. But Greece itself no longer dreamed of empire. Its poets and philosophers turned inward, seeking meaning in the ruins of ambition. The great dramas had ended. The marble glories of the Acropolis already seemed ancient. The polis, that proud invention of the Greek mind, had become too small for the age it had created. And so, as Macedonian armies prepared to cross the sea, Greece entered a new kind of twilight, not of decline, but of transformation. The old world of rival city-states faded into memory, replaced by something vaster, a Greek identity carried not by borders, but by language, art, and thought. From the dusty courtyards of Athens to the mountain villages of Thessaly, people whispered of the young king, his confidence, his brilliance, his burning eyes. Some called him liberator, others feared he would bring ruin. None could have imagined that within a decade he would stand at the edge of the known world, claiming it as his own. And as the night settled over the quiet fields of Chaeronea, where Greek freedom had died, the wind rustled through the olive trees like a memory. The gods, it seemed, had chosen a new favorite, not a city this time, but a man. The age of philosophers was giving way to the age of conquerors. the shadow of Macedonia stretched long across the land. Part 17. The World Conquered. When the young king of Macedonia crossed the narrow strait between Europe and Asia in 334 BCE, few could have guessed that he would redraw the map of the world. Alexander, son of Philip, student of Aristotle, heir to centuries of Greek ambition, stood at the helm of an army of 40,000 men, not the largest ever assembled, but the most disciplined, most hungry, most inspired. Before leaving, he cast a spear into Aegean soil, declaring it conquered in the name of Greece. It was the gesture of a man who believed destiny was already his. The Persian Empire, vast and ancient, awaited him, its cities glittering from Sardis to Babylon, its armies counted in hundreds of thousands. Yet Alexander saw not an empire, but a challenge. He sought not only victory, but immortality. His campaign would become a journey that fused war with myth, turning soldiers into legends and geography into poetry. The first great test came at the Granicus River. Persian satraps lined the far bank, their cavalry gleaming under the spring sun. Alexander, reckless and radiant, led the charge himself, his helmet flashing with white plumes. He was nearly killed, his helmet split by an axe, but he fought free, cutting down his attacker. When the battle ended, the river ran red, and the Persian army scattered. The victory opened Asia Minor, and Greek cities, long under Persian control, hailed him as liberator. He moved swiftly through Phrygia, where he sliced the Gordian knot with a single stroke of his sword, declaring that he had solved the riddle of destiny. Through Cappadocia, Cilicia, and Syria, where the Persian king Darius III gathered his full might. The two armies met at Issus, pressed between sea and mountains. The Persians outnumbered the Greeks several times over, yet their vastness became their weakness. Alexander's phalanx advanced like a single body, and his cavalry broke the enemy line, driving Darius to flight. His chariot abandoned, his family captured. It was not only a victory of arms, but of prestige. The Greeks had humbled the empire that had once burned their temples. From Issus, Alexander turned south, conquering Phoenicia and laying siege to Tyre, a city built upon an island, proud and defiant. For 7 months he battered its walls, building a causeway of stone and corpses through the sea. When at last the city fell, he offered mercy to none. It was a message. Resistance meant extinction. Yet even in vengeance, there was awe. The young king seemed unstoppable, his name already spoken with reverence and fear. In Egypt, the Persians fled before him. The priests of Heliopolis crowned him pharaoh, calling him son of Amun, child of the sun. At the mouth of the Nile, he founded Alexandria, a city to bear his name and the promise of a new world, Greek in spirit, Egyptian in soil, eternal in design. There he visited the oracle at Siwa, deep in the desert, where the high priest addressed him as divine. Whether he believed it or not, Alexander began to act as if he were chosen not by men, but by gods. But the empire of Persia still lived. In 331 BCE, on the plain of Gaugamela, Alexander faced Darius once more. The field stretched vast and open, perfect for Persian chariots and cavalry. Yet Alexander's genius lay in turning weakness into strategy. His phalanx shifted and angled, creating openings that lured the enemy in before collapsing upon them. Darius fled again, his empire shattering behind him. Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis, the jewels of the East, opened their gates. In Persepolis, Alexander stood before the palace of Xerxes, the very king who had once sent armies against Greece. The halls glittered with gold and ivory. The air smelled of myrrh and dust. That night, in a drunken revel, flames consumed the city. Whether by accident or vengeance, no one knows. As the fire rose, Alexander watched in silence. To some, it was justice, to others sacrilege. To him, it was both. But conquest did not still his restlessness. Beyond Persia lay Bactria, Sogdia, and the unknown. He pursued Darius until the king was found murdered by his own men. When Alexander received his body, he covered it with his own cloak and ordered royal burial. The conqueror had replaced the conquered. Yet the further he traveled, the less Greek his campaign became. His men marched through deserts where even the gods were silent, through passes lined with snow and silence. They began to whisper that their king no longer sought victory, but divinity. In India, he faced the armies of King Porus on the banks of the Hydaspes River. The monsoon rain fell heavy, turning the battlefield to mud. Elephants charged through the lines, trumpeting and crushing men beneath their feet. But Alexander's discipline held. The phalanx adjusted, the cavalry encircled, and victory came again. When Porus was brought before him, wounded and proud, Alexander asked how he wished to be treated. The king replied simply, "As a king." Alexander smiled and restored his lands. The soldiers, though, had reached their limits. After years of marching, from Greece to India, 12,000 miles, they refused to go farther. In the valley of the Hyphasis, Alexander stood before them, eyes bright with anger and exhaustion, and realized at last that he could command the world, but not the human heart. He turned back west. The return was harsh. Through the Gedrosian desert, heat and hunger consumed his army. Many died of thirst. Others were lost to storms of sand. Alexander walked among them, sharing their suffering, refusing water unless all could drink. By the time he reached Babylon again, he was not the same man. He had conquered everything, except time. In 323 BCE, still only 32, Alexander fell ill after a banquet and never rose again. Some say fever, some poison, some divine retribution. His empire stretched from Greece to India, yet he left no heir strong enough to hold it. His generals, the Diadochi, divided it among themselves, each carving a kingdom from his dream. Yet his conquest did not die. The Greek language spread across 3 continents, carried by merchants, artists, and scholars. Cities named for him, Alexandria, Antioch, Seleucia, became beacons of learning. From Egypt to Bactria, temples rose with Greek columns beside Eastern altars. The world had been conquered, but more profoundly, it had been connected. For centuries to come, people would speak of him as more than mortal, part hero, part god, part child of thunder. Yet beneath the legend was a truth more human, that curiosity, courage, and ambition together could alter the shape of civilization. When night falls over the ruins of Persepolis, the wind still moves through its broken halls like a memory. Somewhere within it lingers the echo of hoofbeats, the flash of bronze, the whisper of a young king who once believed the world could be his. And for a fleeting moment it was. Part 18, Science and the Stars. When the noise of conquest faded and Alexander's body was laid to rest, a quieter revolution began, one not of spears, but of thought. His empire, though shattered into kingdoms, had scattered Greek ideas like seeds on the wind. From Egypt to Persia, those seeds took root in new soil, mingling with the knowledge of older worlds. The result was a flowering unlike anything before, the age of Hellenistic science, where the human mind reached beyond temples and battlefields, into the stars themselves. The city that became its heart was Alexandria, the gleaming jewel of the Nile Delta, Alexander's most enduring creation. Here, the blue of the Mediterranean met the gold of the desert, and the air carried the scent of salt and papyrus. Ships from every land crowded its harbor. Its streets echoed with the voices of Greeks, Egyptians, Jews, and Persians. It was the first truly cosmopolitan city, a meeting place of minds. At its center stood the Library of Alexandria, the greatest repository of knowledge the ancient world would ever know. Founded by the Ptolemies, the Macedonian dynasty that ruled Egypt after Alexander E.'s death, It gathered scrolls from every corner of the known world. Agents scoured ports and markets, buying or copying every text they could find. Mathematics from Babylon, medicine from India, philosophy from Athens. Within its marble halls, scholars from across the Mediterranean studied by lamplight, their whispers of discovery rising like prayers. Beside the library stood the museum, not a collection of art, but a sanctuary for learning, gardens, observatories, laboratories. Here thinkers lived, ate, and worked together, supported by the state, free from the burdens of war or trade. It was the first research institute in history, a place where curiosity itself was honored as sacred. Among those who walked its corridors was Euclid, who gathered the scattered truths of geometry into his Elements, a work so precise that it would endure for over 2 millennia. In his pages, the Greeks' love of order became a universal language, lines, angles, and proofs, shaping a world where reason could not be conquered. There is no royal road to geometry, he told a king, reminding even rulers that truth demands effort. Another, Eratosthenes, measured the earth with little more than sunlight and shadows. By comparing the angles of the noon sun in 2 distant cities, he calculated the planet's circumference with astonishing accuracy, proof that the world was not only round, but measurable. Where myth once ruled, observation now spoke. Archimedes, working in Syracuse, became the mind's warrior. He discovered the principles of buoyancy and levers, proclaiming, "Give me a place to stand, and I will move the earth." He built mirrors that set ships aflame, pulleys that lifted armies, equations that balanced the cosmos. Yet he remained humble, tracing circles in the sand, even as Roman soldiers stormed his city. "Do not disturb my circles," he said, his final words, a plea for thought amid violence. The stars, too, became subjects of wonder. Astronomers like Aristarchus of Samos dared to imagine that the earth might orbit the sun, a truth too bold for his time, yet one that would return centuries later to reshape the universe. Others charted the heavens, naming constellations, predicting eclipses, finding rhythm in the infinite. Medicine advanced as well. In Alexandria, Herophilus dissected the human body for the first time, mapping veins, nerves, and the brain. He distinguished between arteries and veins, calling the pulse the music of life. His colleague Erasistratus studied the heart, proposing that it pumped blood like a bellows. Though centuries would pass before their findings were fully accepted, their courage marked the birth of anatomy. Mathematicians, engineers, and inventors built upon one another's work. The Antikythera mechanism, discovered centuries later from a shipwreck, revealed the astonishing complexity of Greek mechanics. A clockwork device that could predict the movements of the planets. In stone and bronze, they built machines that imitated the very heavens. Even philosophy adapted to this new world. The old city-states were gone. Empires now ruled men's lives. Yet thinkers sought meaning amid that vastness. Epicurus taught that happiness lay in simplicity and friendship, not in wealth or fear. Zeno of Citium founded Stoicism, preaching endurance, reason, and the acceptance of fate. His followers believed virtue was the only true good, and that peace came from aligning one's will with nature's order. In these teachings, one hears the echo of the old Greek balance, moderation reborn in a larger world. The philosophers of the Hellenistic age no longer dreamed of perfect cities, but of tranquil souls. They built no new Parthenons, they built inner harmony instead. And through all this, the Greeks continued to observe, to record, to measure. They mapped the trade winds, designed water clocks, invented screw pumps, and refined mathematics into art. Even as kingdoms rose and fell, the pursuit of knowledge endured, a faith more enduring than empire. At night, Alexandria shone with lamplight reflected on the sea. From its great Pharos lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders of the world, the flame burned for sailors across the horizon, a beacon of both safety and intellect. It was said that from its peak one could see the curve of the earth itself, as if the Greeks, having conquered the world, now sought to understand it. Their discoveries would travel far, absorbed by Rome, preserved by Byzantium, translated by Arabs, and reborn in the Renaissance. The thread of reason, spun in Athens and strengthened in Alexandria, would never fully break, and when the lamps of the library were finally extinguished, whether by fire, war, or neglect, their light did not die. It lived on in every question that began with why, in every hand that drew a circle, in every gaze that turned upward to the stars. For the Greeks had found in the heavens not gods alone, but order, and in that order a reflection of themselves. Part 19. From Greece to Rome. By the 2nd century before Christ, the world that Alexander had built, a world of blended gods, mingled tongues, and shared ideas, had begun to change again. The Greek kingdoms that once stretched from Egypt to India were fading, consumed by internal rivalries and by a rising power from the west. In the hills of Italy, a new people had learned the lessons of Greece and sharpened them into something both disciplined and enduring. Their name was Rome. Rome had admired Greece for centuries, her art, her architecture, her philosophy. But admiration did not mean equality. The Romans were not dreamers, they were builders. They took what the Greeks had imagined and made it law, road, and empire. Where the Greeks sought wisdom, the Romans sought order. Yet the two worlds would soon merge, shaping the civilization that still defines much of ours. When the Roman legions first crossed into the Greek world, they came as conquerors, but they arrived like students entering a grand old library. The Greek cities, weakened by centuries of division, fell one by one. Corinth was burned in 146 BCE, its treasures sent to Rome. Macedonia became a Roman province. But even in defeat, Greece triumphed, for Rome did not destroy her, it absorbed her. The poet Horace would later write, "Greece, conquered, took her conqueror captive." Greek teachers filled Roman schools. Sculptors and architects traveled west, carving temples and statues that turned Roman cities into new Athenses. The language of the educated became Greek. The ideals of virtue, beauty, and reason became Roman virtues too. In the villas of senators, philosophers debated in the same tones once heard in the Athenian agora. The marble and the mind of Greece had found a second life. In Athens itself, life continued under Roman watch. The city, though no longer a power, remained a place of pilgrimage for those who sought learning. Emperors sent gifts to its temples. Students from across the empire studied in its schools. The Academy of Plato, the Lyceum of Aristotle, though aged, still whispered the old wisdom. Stoicism, revived in Rome by thinkers like Seneca and Marcus Aurelius, carried the calm dignity of Greek virtue into imperial halls. Even Greek art took on new form. Roman sculptors copied Greek statues so perfectly that many of the originals we know today survive only in their Roman shadows. The Greek idea of the ideal body, the perfect harmony of flesh and form, became the Roman symbol of divine authority. Temples rose with Doric columns and marble friezes, their symmetry a language all could understand. Yet the Greeks themselves had changed. The old independence of the polis, the city-state, was gone. Their role now was as teachers, astronomers, physicians, and artists within a greater world. In Alexandria, scholars still studied the stars, their discoveries recorded on papyrus. In Rhodes, sailors built ships guided by Greek mathematics. In Antioch and Pergamon, philosophers debated the balance of fate and free will. Under Roman rule, the Greek world became a network of knowledge, less political, more intellectual. Ideas, not armies, were its currency. From the Aegean to the Nile, Greek became the language of science, scripture, and trade. Even the early Christians writing their Gospels chose Greek as their tongue. The words that would shape Western faith were written in the same alphabet that had once sung of Zeus and Athena. Rome gave Greece peace, but also silence. The days of shouting assemblies and bold democracy were gone. The world had grown too large for such fragile forms. Yet the spirit of Greece endured, not in power, but in persistence. Every Roman general who quoted Homer, every scholar who read Aristotle, every artisan who measured beauty by proportion, all kept the flame alive. And still, Greece remained itself, a land of olive groves and mountain winds, of fishermen and shepherds, of sunlight falling on broken columns. Travelers from Rome came to see the ruins of the Parthenon, to walk where Socrates had once spoken, to feel the weight of time. They stood amid the marble and realized that empire might conquer bodies, but never ideas. In the quiet that followed conquest, Greece became something more profound than a nation. She became a memory, a shared inheritance of the human mind. Her gods faded, her cities crumbled, but her thought endured. The logic of Aristotle, the geometry of Euclid, the plays of Sophocles, the philosophy of the Stoics, all were now part of the Roman world, and through Rome they would belong to the world that followed. By the 1st century BCE, the Mediterranean had become a single sea under Roman law, but it still spoke with a Greek accent. The two civilizations, so different in heart, had intertwined like vines, one wild, one disciplined, creating a balance neither could achieve alone. At night in Rome, senators discussed Plato under the flicker of oil lamps. In Greece, old men told their grandchildren of the days when cities ruled themselves. The torch had passed, but the light remained. And as centuries turned, and the empire itself began to tremble under its own weight, that same light would guide the next chapter of history, carried eastward toward Constantinople, where Greece would find a second life, and the wisdom of its ancestors would outlast the empire that once ruled it. The age of Greece as a political power had ended, but the age of Greece as an idea, that had only just begun. Part 20. The Eternal Legacy. The story of Greece does not end with conquest. It endures, not in empires or monuments, but in the quiet pulse of thought itself. Long after her armies vanished and her temples fell to ruin, the Greek spirit lingered, invisible yet unyielding, shaping how the world would think, speak, and dream. Every civilization that followed carried a fragment of her. The Romans borrowed her architecture, her logic, her gods. Byzantium spoke her language and prayed in her hymns. When the scholars of the Renaissance looked for the roots of reason, they found them in Greek pages half crumbled by time. When scientists drew circles and measured the stars, they echoed Euclid and Aristarchus. When democracy spoke of liberty and law, they repeated the old voices of Athens, the belief that truth could be debated, not decreed. And even now, beneath the hum of our modern world, Greece remains. Her alphabet still spells the symbols of science. Her tragedies still echo in theater and film. Her philosophies still whisper that happiness lies not in wealth or power, but in balance, sophrosin, moderation, the harmony of mind and soul. Yet the legacy of Greece is not only found in what it gave the world, it lives in what it asked of it. The Greeks were never content to worship or obey blindly. They questioned the gods, their rulers, and even themselves. They looked at the world and said, "Why?" They turned curiosity into a compass, guiding humanity from myth to reason, from chaos to understanding. Their cities may have quarreled and fallen, but their questions never died. What is justice? What is beauty? What is the good life? These are still our questions. Each generation answers them differently, yet the dialogue remains the same. A conversation begun in the shade of olive trees 2.5 millennia ago. Walk among the ruins of Greece today. The cracked columns, the faded mosaics, the marble steps worn smooth by centuries of feet, and the silence feels alive. Cicadas hum in the heat, waves whisper against the stones, and in that stillness you can almost hear them, the echo of voices long gone, the rhythm of thought that built the foundations of the modern mind. The Greeks did not seek immortality in conquest or wealth. They sought it in memory, to live on not as rulers but as teachers, to shape not what people own but how they see. In that they succeeded beyond measure. Their gods have faded, their empires are dust, yet their presence endures wherever humans seek truth, beauty, or meaning. The theater, the academy, the law court, the observatory, all are descendants of the same dream, that knowledge and wonder belong to everyone, and perhaps that is Greece's greatest gift, not her temples, nor her heroes, but her faith in the human mind, the belief that wisdom is not divine revelation, but the quiet work of questioning, observing, and creating. So when you look up tonight and trace the constellations the Greeks once named, Orion, Cassiopeia, Andromeda, remember that you share the same sky they did, the same longing, the same awe, the same search for meaning among the stars. For as long as there are minds that ask, hearts that wonder, and hands that build, Greece will never be gone. It lives in the way we think. It lives in the way we dream. It lives in you.